I now have the great privilege to be able to invite to speak somebody who has served as and continues to serve as one of our most critical leaders in the United Nations system, Her Excellency Ms. Inger Andersen, the Executive Director of the United Nations Environment Program. Since 2019, she has served in this esteemed role. Between 2015 and 2019, Ms. Andersen was the Director General of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. And prior to joining that, she held various leadership roles at the World Bank and the United Nations. Most recently, she was Vice President of the Middle East and North Africa at the World Bank, and previous to that, Vice President for Sustainable Development and head of the CGIAR Fund Council. It gives me great pleasure to also share that Ms. Inger was very quick to respond to an outreach as soon as the COVID disaster struck us all in order to jointly make a case for why religions matter in this very critical space to the very survival of the planet that we are living on today. Ms. Andersen, the floor is yours.
Thank you very, very much. Let me start by thanking His Excellency Gudni Johannesson, President of Iceland, and of course you, Professor Karam. It's a pleasure to be with you. But all the excellencies, the faith leaders, the ladies and gentlemen, and not least Gudmundur Gudbrandsson, who is the Environment Minister and who has been a steady and solid friend of UNEP and indeed environment leaders. Let me start because at this time, at a time unimaginable, just a few months ago, we couldn't have imagined, we are living and seeing how our carelessness with the stewardship which has been granted to us has delivered us to a crisis of global proportions. That stewardship to which I refer is, of course, the stewardship of taking care of planet Earth, our only home. But humanity's gray and dirty development path is systematically snipping away at the glorious and complex web of nature. Each snip is in its own a tragedy. The end of an ecosystem, the end of a species, the polluted lake. But when we take it together, they are threatening the very collapse of the entire fragile web of life on Earth as we know it. COVID-19 has brought this truth home in a manner that is hard and cold. A tiny virus has dragged our societies and our economies to their knees. A virus that is, like many other zoonotic diseases, transmitted between humans and animals, part and parcel of the three planetary crises, the climate crisis, the nature and biodiversity crisis, and the pollution and waste crisis. We're facing these three crises because nature has become a commodity. The atmosphere, the land, the oceans are our dumping ground. For decades, we have produced and consumed, thrown away at the expense of the natural world, even after we learned about the damage we were doing. But nature is humanity's biggest ally, providing the basic ingredients, not just for our prosperity, but for our very existence. Prioritizing nature's conservation and recovery is essential to the health of people and economy. This is why putting nature-based solutions, these solutions with which we invest, we protect, we regenerate, and wisely use nature's bounty for our well-being. This is why this is so important, because when we protect our climate, when we protect our waterways, when we protect our oceans and our nature, we are protecting our own very future. But too often we forget that protecting nature is not only about us. We also have a moral duty to protect and use wisely the planet, its bounty, and every living being on it. This is a duty that is integral to every faith and every belief system, which all agree that nature is an act of divinity that should be treated as such by humans with a sense of the stewardship bestowed upon us. Nor do faith preach self-enrichment or egotism. Faith calls for selflessness, for humility, for love, for respect, for nurturing, and for transformation. These are the values of our planet, and the poor and the vulnerable who suffer the most from environmental degradation need now more than ever our support. For all these reasons, people of faith and those who lead them have an imperative to act. And we see 4 areas of action where we hope that faith leaders will step in, lean in, and act. First, faith leaders and communities hold the power to transform our world. Second, faith leaders can influence the behavior of billions of people. Third, faith leaders can use the assets of their faith community to finance and drive green transition. And fourth, faith leaders can prioritize nature in the humanitarian programs working across borders and across faiths. So let me start with that first one, embedding science in the teaching to increase nature positive behavior. Faiths and beliefs gives us our purpose and meaning. Faith provides a moral path to follow, sifts good from evil, defines right from wrong. Environmental science does not, as we heard from His Excellency the President, undermine any of those core faiths. Science simply tells us what we can do to live in harmony with nature, with that moral imperative that faith teaches us, that respect for all living things. Science tells us how moving to clean energy can reduce emissions that are warming our planet. Science tells us how conserving and restoring nature can strengthen the life support system upon which we rely. Science tells us how moving to circular models of production and consumption that sustainably use scarce resources will give the planet and all the diverse creatures that it contains a chance to thrive. Faith and science are not mutually exclusive. The pandemic shows that faith leaders get this, understand this, live this. When the science called for lockdowns and social distancing, houses of worship across the world made that sacrifice and closed the doors based on science, but in the spirit of faith. So I urge all faith leaders to embed environmental science in your teaching, in churches, in mosques, in synagogues, in temples, in schools, in universities. Rely on science and the wisdom of learning, not on disinformation. Encourage youth to demand better of their leaders. Drive home the messages to the faithful that how we live is destroying the work of creation and that we have the power to turn this around. Ask the faithful to reduce their waste, turn green forms of transport, shift diets, put money into investments that support our collective and fairer and more sustainable future. And many faithful run their own businesses, large and small. Remind these business owners that it is their duty to care for nature in their business practices too, and that short-term profits can cause long-term damage to nature. Faith-based organizations wield that power to influence across much of the world's populations, and we call on them to use it. Secondly, green those assets that you manage. As important as it is to preach behavior change, and it is, faith-based organizations can be the change themselves by greening the many and varied assets that they own. Faith-based investments institutions are the 4th largest economic power on the planet. And meanwhile, the climate, nature, and pollution agendas are very underfunded. Faith-based organizations can drive away from dirty energy and put their wealth into investments that back green and nature-positive futures. Over 40 faith-based organizations with over $1 billion in assets have already committed to divestment. But that's not enough. The economic power of faiths turned to responsible investment, and the green economy can be a major driver of positive change as we recover from the current pandemic. And faith-based organizations owns bricks and mortar across the world too. There are over 100 million houses of worship, not to mention the countless schools and university. Green building principles should be applied to reduce the impacts of those buildings already standing and for new buildings that are yet to come. Faith-based organizations own over 5% of the world's commercial forests, making faith-based organizations important players in conservation. But it's not just about what faiths own. It is also about giving the faith and practices of indigenous peoples the space to operate. According to IPBES, the Science-Based Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, land owned, managed, used, and occupied by indigenous people are much better managed than other lands. This is why UNEP is proud to coordinate the Interfaith Rainforest Initiative. This initiative empowers indigenous people to manage their land in 5 countries, which contains 70% of the world's remaining forests. My third point deals with what faith leaders can do to provide nature-based solutions to the socioeconomic challenges through your good work. And here, faith provides practical support to billions of people, especially in times of crisis. We're seeing this in action during the pandemic as faith-based organizations around the world offer food, housing, support, donation, medical services, help for education at home, etc. Such charitable work is important and admirable in all tenets of faith. But environmental degradation is also an issue of inequality. It is the poor, the less fortunate, who suffer the most from climate change, from pollution, and from biodiversity loss. Every effort to reduce the environmental impact of faith-based organizations will help, and so will sustainable nature-based solutions implemented on the ground through charitable endeavors. And finally, my fourth point, establish networks that make us stronger together. To return to my earlier point, faiths are about the collective, not the individual. Congregations unite to raise their voices in worship, to help those in need, to feel a sense of community and belonging. And such collectivism is also the founding principle of the United Nations, which celebrates 75 years, its 75th anniversary this year, of uniting nations for a common goal. Intra and interfaith collaboration brings out the very best that each faith can offer and ensures peace and prosperity. Promoting such collaboration is a large part of the reason that this conference is taking place. Establishing proposed Faith for Earth coalition will bring faiths organizations together and create partnerships with intergovernmental organizations, states, and other stakeholders, a powerful coalition for sustainable tomorrow. Excellencies, eminences, ladies and gentlemen, faith and faiths are one of the most compelling drivers of human behavior. Faith has shaped our world for millennia. The environmental movement is still young, which may explain why we have not fully partnered and collaborated with the power of faith to protect our common home, planet Earth. But we are no longer dealing in millennia. Humanity has at most decades to implement systemic shifts, those systemic changes that need to head off the environmental catastrophe of climate change. So it is time to focus the full transformative power of faith, the love, the respect, and the wisdom inherent in faith's teachings onto creating a greener, a fairer, and more sustainable world. I thank the organizers in Iceland for having been so generous in organizing this conference. I thank all the sponsors and all the faiths participating. I look very much forward to your deliberations. Thank you.